I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
That was President Lyndon B. Johnson on March 31st, 1968, addressing the nation and saying that he would not be seeking a second term. Now, LBJ's decision is the subject of an op-ed penned by Northwestern professor Kevin Boyle. The op-ed, "LBJ did it in 1968, Biden can do it too," makes the case for Biden to step away from the presidency just as LBJ did.
In his op-ed, Boyle says, quote, "More than anything else, LBJ was hoping that by ending his campaign, he could defuse an existential threat to the nation. The details may be different, but the situation Biden is facing is the same too." LBJ occupied the Oval Office from 1963 to 1969 during a time of national upheaval. There was the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, political assassinations, and riots in the streets. The United States was as politically divided then as it is today. Here to discuss further is author, New York Times columnist, and professor of history at Northwestern University, Kevin Boyle. Professor Boyle, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, the big question here is, historically, LBJ stepped down at the end of March. It's now July. That would make Joe Biden the latest candidate to ever step away from the presidential campaign. Is it simply too late for Joe Biden to do this without derailing the entire party?
There's enormous risks in him stepping down at this point. There's no doubt about that. But there is a convention that's coming up in Chicago, and that does give the party the opportunity to refocus on a different candidate.
So let's talk about what led to LBJ's decision to drop out. I believe he had lost a primary. He was deeply unpopular. There were protests every time he tried to speak anywhere in the country. Public frustration from all sides with what was happening in Vietnam was massive. He was, but what was the mechanism of it? Did the people around him come to him and say, "There is no way you will win if you either the nomination or the presidency"? What was what actually motivated him to make that very difficult decision? Because as we've seen, our political leaders really like to stay in power and really like to seek additional power, even if it's a hard sell.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense inside the White House that he was a severely damaged candidate. There's no doubt about that. The White House understood that. Lyndon Johnson understood that. But people did not, in fact, come to him and say that he ought to withdraw from the campaign. His closest advisors didn't tell him that. That was a personal decision he came to in the face of a really profound set of crises that had culminated in about the 2 weeks before his withdrawal from the race at the end of March of 1968.
Now, I want to go back to what you mentioned a little bit earlier, because as you said, Democrats have a convention coming up. The big difference that I can see is in 1968, the party system was much stronger in the Democratic Party than it is in 2024. It's a very candidate-based system now. I mean, what challenges would the party as an entity have in even understanding how to operate a brokered convention after so long without one?
Yeah, there are multiple differences between the party in 1968 and the party today. The party today is essentially a party that had been constructed, especially in the presidential nominating process, because of 1968, because the party fractured in 1968, because there were multiple candidates running. There were 3 candidates, including Johnson, running before he withdrew from the race. Eugene McCarthy is an anti-war candidate, Bobby Kennedy is an anti-war candidate, and Johnson himself. So the party had factionalized in a serious way, but it was possible in 68 for a candidate to win the nomination of the party without actually running in primaries, which is what Hubert Humphrey in the end did. He didn't run in any primaries in 1968. And that fact led to the transformation of the party so that it's now a primary-driven system. So the challenge becomes structurally for the party, how does the party pick a new nominee, especially as you just mentioned, in this incredibly tight time frame? And then there's also the question of fundraising, which was in fact Hubert Humphrey's enormous problem as nominee as well. What happens to the process of collecting the vast amounts of money now that presidential candidates seek? So there's a whole set of intense practical problems to consider in this situation. The flip side, of course, is the danger that I think the nation faces by having a candidate who huge portions of the electorate see now as incapable of serving as president. That's the great danger on the flip side.
There's no way, that has to be a decision that Biden himself makes, as LBJ himself made it back in 1968. And what we're hearing is that the people Biden listens to, those closest to him, his family, which includes his wife Jill Biden, and even Hunter Biden has emerged as a vocal proponent of his father continuing to run. Those people are still telling him to go for it. There's no mechanism to have him not be the candidate unless he assents to that.
Yeah, it absolutely has to be a decision that he and his family come to. And I suppose what I would hope is that as the family grapples with that decision, that what they start to think about isn't that his withdrawal is a terrible defeat. It's not that his withdrawal is a concession. It's an act of patriotism.
And there's also a look at how Lyndon Johnson actually did this. I mean, that announcement that he would not run again came as a shock even to some of his closest advisors. He kept that very close. Is there a way for Joe Biden to do this that doesn't send such a cataclysmic shockwave through Democratic circles?
I think that we're moving the party, and I think the nation is moving to the point that it wouldn't be a cataclysmic shockwave through the system. I think if he were to say today that he was dropping out of the race because he felt that he had done what he wanted to do and he did enormously important things in the course of his administration, and that he is simply at a point in his life. This is hard, man. I mean, it is really hard to acknowledge that point in your life. But that if he were willing to say to the American people, look, I have reached a point in my life where I don't feel that I can do this job effectively for the next 4 years, which is what we are talking about here in an election campaign. I don't think the shock through the system, there'd be enormous shock, there's no doubt about it, but I don't think that it would be enormous seismic shock the way it was with Lyndon Johnson, because people, as you just said, people didn't see that coming at all. Now people are primed for that to happen.
Yeah, I think something... now in American politics, it seems to me like it's become rarer for political figures to resign for any reason. For the kind of scandals that used to, your financial improprieties, even like legal message. I mean, Donald Trump's running for another term. Sex-based scandals, things that, when it happened to a representative or a governor or a state senator or something, or a candidate, they're like, okay, I'm done. Now, political figures just stick it out. It is as far as I can tell how things have changed in the last, even recently, maybe in the last 10 years. Now you just ignore it and you just move on, and eventually the news cycle moves on to something else. We have very elderly people at very senior levels of government. Dianne Feinstein just died in office. There was no question that she was incapable of doing her job for the last however many months or years while in office. It's become the norm for the political figures to just stick it out. I think that is what has changed since LBJ's day.
Yeah, man, I couldn't agree with you more that this is such a different world. To even extend that farther, 30 years ago, candidates could be driven out of office or forced not to even run on scandals that today we can't even imagine stopping somebody from running. So yeah, I am absolutely with you on that. maybe one way of thinking about that question, though, is that people have said over and over again, and I think it's a fair characterization, that Biden is an old-fashioned politician. Maybe this is the time to draw on that older tradition rather than the one we're in today.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.